Annette Bay was from Trinity Bay, but Conception Bay is also a great spot for fairy stories. For whatever reason, it seems that Conception Bay is one of those places in the province that has managed to maintain something of a fairy tradition. And there are lots of places that people claim are fairy haunted. Perhaps that tradition is not as strong as it once was, but Conception Bay remains one of those places where I continue to hear stories about the little people. And while I love ghost stories, fairy stories are my favorite kind of stories to hear and tell. There is something mysterious, and in Newfoundland, slightly sinister about the traditional fairy stories that people used to tell. They often aren't long tales, but they always fascinate me. Most of the stories I have heard about the little people take place in the warm months, but a story from North River, which is just north of where Kelly and I have a house, involves a man who goes out cutting wood with disastrous results, and is one of the few I've come across that specifically takes place in winter. I originally heard the story from Linda Reed, who in turn had learned the story from an older woman in North River, while Linda was working on a local oral history project. In the story, a man went out to cut wood, taking his horse and slide. He was gone longer than expected, and eventually his wife grew worried. Neighbors went up into the wood and found the man who was stretched out on the path in front of the horse and slide, cold in death. The men brought him back to North River, where he was waked and buried. And from that point on, people said that he had been killed by the fairies. For when he was found on the path, there was a tiny, angry red handprint burned into the side of his face. While stories of the fairies killing someone are rare, there are many stories of the fairies leading people astray and then returning them changed in some way. Margaret Iad of Bay Roberts is familiar with many of the old fairy stories and is no stranger to the idea of people being fairy-led. I did an interview with her, and this is what she said. "Here is one of the fairy stories that I collected when I was teaching at Ascension Collegiate," says Iad. "I have a number of these stories that I collected from students. I tried to collect ghost stories too. The ghost stories seem to have been corrupted by TV and movies, while the fairy stories seem true to their natural environment and social setting." Iad's story dates back to the 1930s and came originally from South River, the opposite side of Clark's Beach from North River. And it was told to Iad by Georgina Marshall of South River, who in turn had learned it from Gretchen Marshall. A little girl, 10 years of age, went berry picking alone one day. When it got late and she didn't return, her family got worried and went looking for her. They didn't find her that night, so the next day they sent a search party to look for her. Now, folklorists and storytellers, and there are a few here tonight, love things that come in threes. And surely enough, the search party looked for 3 days and 3 nights. It was not until the 3rd night that a man found a lost 10-year-old girl. The man asked the girl who she was and why she was in the woods alone. The girl, however, was unable to answer with any certainty. She didn't know who she was, but she knew that she was from South River. And so the man took her home, and when she was reunited with her family, she shared a strange story to explain her disappearance. She said she went so deep in the woods because she was following the little people, explains Iad. From then she was never the same. The people concluded from this that she had been fairy changed. And there are still people around Conception Bay that tell those types of stories. Look at Dennis here. I'm sure Dennis has heard more than one story like that about people being taken away by the fairies in Conception Bay. Margaret had great stories as well about strange stories. There's a thing that happens in Newfoundland where people will get a blast. They'll be blasted by the fairies, and they'll get a wound, and then something will come out of that wound. Usually it's something of nature. It'd be moss and twigs, or little feathers, or little bones, or something that will come out of the wound. But Margaret had great stories from Conception Bay about someone who had gotten a fairy blast, and when they would cut open the swelling, they would pull out, like ribbons of paper would come out of the wounds on people's bodies. I'm going to finish with one story.